It's actually a really exciting moment for me because this is my first talk at a bigger Drupal event, and I'm glad I can share with you what we learned introducing PHP Stan to a large-scale project. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Simon, and I work as a backend developer at Factorial. And actually, I feel quite comfortable here at the Faculty of Mathematics at the University of Vienna, because I also studied mathematics. And I have a background in developing algorithms in numerical mathematics. Yeah, but then I switched over to web development when I founded a platform with a couple of friends. It was a nonprofit where we connect volunteers with social organizations. And this platform was based on Drupal. And then since a year ago, I was very lucky to join Factorial. Now let's look at the agenda of this talk. Fair warning, we're not going to go into a deep dive into the technical details. This talk is more about what is PHP Stan, how we can use it, particularly why we should use it, and then how you introduce PHP Stan to a large-scale project. And as you can hear, my voice is escaping me a little bit, which is sad. But I'm trying to power through. Okay, now, first of all, what is PHP Stan? And I was sitting down in the cafe with my sister, and she was asking me about my talk here at the Drupal Dev Days. And she's also in the technical field, but she's not really a software developer. So I tried to come up with an example. And I really like to create visuals. That's also because of the background in mathematics. If everything is really abstract, then you lose sight of what you're actually doing. So sometimes it's really good to have a picture in your head. So I'm also trying to draw a picture for you. Essentially, this will be about making coffee. So you can imagine the process. Maybe you have a water cooker. You get the water from the faucet, then you put the water cooker on the mounting, and you steam up the water. Then maybe you have a French press with some coffee. The water flows into the French press, mixes up with the coffee, and after it's settled, finally you can pour it in your cup, and then hopefully from the cup it goes into your mouth. So you can see there's different devices involved, and there's different processes happening. And this is what I call the flow of code, or in this case, the flow of coffee. Now, usually what we do is we run our code. This is when the code is flowing. But sometimes when we run the code, it's already too late. And it would be nice to know beforehand, before we're running the code, if there are any errors. So what PHP Stan does, it focuses on finding errors in your code without actually running it. Okay, now, of course, we need some examples. And before I show the examples, I have to say it's really hard to come up with simple examples that also have some little mistake and are generally known. So the examples, it's not particularly about the code. It's more about getting it into the headspace of what we're looking at. So imagine you're doing a code review, and you get something like this. What we want to do here is we want to get an absolute URL from an URI. And I'm not really recommending to do this, but you will find spots even in core where we use something like this. Okay, actually a developer who made this did a pretty good job already. We see there's types and arguments. We also have return types. And then we have the stream wrapper manager. What are stream wrappers? I heard this before. Okay, public, private. If we have an URI like this, we have to transform it somehow. And then maybe this thing has this factory method, get via URI. And we get a stream wrapper. Okay, now hopefully you have seen these ternary operators before. So again, we did a pretty good job. This essentially means, is the stream wrapper there? If yes, then get the external URL. If not, then return false. We didn't find the file, so we couldn't get the absolute URL. Of course, I tricked you a little bit. And PHPStan would give you an error message like this: static call to instant method get via URI. So actually, this is not a factory method. But if you imagine you're in a code review situation, the client is sitting in your back, and you want to ship something really fast, and maybe you don't know everything about stream wrappers, this could actually go by. And I call this situation pouring your coffee on the table, because this will not work. And then maybe these beautiful flowers, they will sit in a little pot of coffee. In Drupal terms, this means white screen of death. Okay, then how can we fix something like this? We can just use dependency injection and then use the method properly. Pretty easy. Now, next example. This is the same use case. And if we're looking at this, we get a little bit nostalgic. Such a beautiful static function call. But most people who look at this probably already know where this is going. File create URL is actually deprecated, because we want to get away from these static function calls. And if you run PHPStan analysis, you will get an error message like this: call to deprecated function, and it was deprecated in Drupal 9.3, and will be removed in Drupal 10. I call this situation pouring your coffee in your favorite old and beautiful cup. So you can imagine you have this old cup sitting there, maybe it has a little crack, and it's a lot of fun to drink your coffee from this cup, but at some point, if you put it a lot more times into the dishwasher, it may break, and again, the coffee's gonna spill, and probably after Drupal 10, white screen of death. If you want to fix something like this, and you see an error like this, then you can find really nice change records on Drupal.org, and you will find, okay, there's actually a service for this now, file URL generator. Okay, now the next example. This one is a little more theoretical, but I really want to challenge a bit how we as a Drupal community treat our code. This is about tightening up your code. So what is the situation here? Somehow we want to get the absolute URL of a file from a node. And again, this is written pretty well. The input argument, we decorated that's a node interface, so we know it's probably fieldable. And somehow we're getting this file entity from this field file. And then the developer even made a check if the file is empty, because maybe it was not attached to this node. And then if it's not empty, then we can get this absolute URL via the method provided by this file entity. Very nice. So this can work, but again, there are some issues. And here, we maybe have to change our perspective, because, okay, if we take this and we look from the outside, everything works. But you should take the perspective from the code. So what does the code actually know about field file, for example? What does it know about the entities? And then there's also this empty call. Empty is not really specific. So we got to be a little bit careful here. Okay, PHPStan would give us a call to an undefined method, create file URL. This is exactly the scenario. We don't know what file is, and we cannot for sure know if this method exists. I call this situation pouring your coffee into the sugar bowl. Oh, it's so sweet, right? We like to program like this. But for some people, this coffee then might be too sweet, including me. And then also maybe this sugar bowl is smaller than your usual cup, and again, it will overflow at some point. Now I'll show you one way we can solve this. We can just ask, is our file instance of file interface? If we do this, this will be solid. We will always know that this method exists, create file URL. Okay, I hope everyone is in the mood now. Just some more notes. Of course, we can use asserts here. Then we get some nice logging also on these instance of calls. And then also some of these methods that I showed, they throw some exceptions. We should take care of them. But summarizing this section, PHP Stan is doing a lot of the work analyzing the flow of the code. It proves that all the components that we're using are working together and that they match well. Okay, now everyone is excited. Let's get a quick start guide. And yeah, this slide, you don't really have to remember. Just search for how to install Drupal PHP Stan. But I want to show you how easy it is. Again, hopefully you're using Composer, and we need some dependencies. So PHP Stan is actually used in the wider PHP community. It's not Drupal specific. And the PHP Stan Drupal package from Matt Glarman is actually an extension of PHP Stan. What does extension mean? Somehow we have to teach PHP Stan how Drupal works. So we can just think of a couple examples. We have some magic methods. We have some rules. We want to use dependency injection, these kind of stuff. Second thing we need is some configuration. And this is a PHP Stan neon file in your root folder. And if you do a minimal configuration, probably would look something like this. You can define a level. We'll get to this later. For the beginning, level 0 means PHP Stan runs. And then you can define some paths. So for example, here we have some custom modules and some custom theme files. Who's wondering about neon? Don't be afraid. This is pretty similar to YAML. And then we're all set and done. We can execute the PHP Stan analyze, and it will give us the first results for our code base. Pretty easy. Now we're getting into why to use PHP Stan. And imagine you have a project running, and if you did this setup, it's pretty sure that PHP Stan will find some errors in your project, maybe many errors. And if there's some product owners or product managers among you, the question arises, is it worth to introduce PHP Stan? Many errors means that we need developer time for the fixes. And then it becomes a budget question. And maybe you can negotiate a little bit with your client for maintenance fixes, but as you know, most of the clients don't understand that maintenance is also important. So when I was thinking about this slide, I was thinking about the pros and cons and conditions and maybe a timeline. But the only thing I can say to this question as an answer is a loud and a resounding yes. The long-term benefits outweigh the short-term investment by far. You write more maintainable, more secure, more clean code, which is also future-proof. And it not only benefits your code, but it also teaches your developers. It will improve the collaboration. And in the end, it will make shipping code a lot faster. One more thing to say about this. This is not a decision that one developer should do by themselves. This is a decision that you should make together as a team. So when we introduce this in Factorial, we have a format that we call backend working group, essentially a meeting where the backend developers come together. And I made a presentation. And then we had great discussions about it. How can we adopt it in our project? Just get everyone on board. Now, to look a little bit more into detail, we should find out where PHP Stan is most helpful. And this is a very simplified overview of how a developer task looks like. Before starting the task, usually there's a discussion about semantics. So maybe you sit together with one of your developers and you're discussing how can we accomplish this task. What kind of services should we use? Should we use a plugin? Should we make a new model? Things like this. Then some time goes by, someone implements the task, and then hopefully at some point there's a code review. And if you haven't seen the talk, a Drupal core maintainer shares peer code review best practices by Jess, also here at the Drupal Dev Days, then you should definitely do that. I hope there's a recording of it, because there you can see some benefits of doing code reviews. But in software development, there's an inherent problem. The code that we want to ship has to be correct. Also, we want it to be maintainable. We want it to be secure, and we want it to be future-proof. But you can be honest, if there's a pressing client in the back again, and maybe you have a merge request with many iterations, it will lead to compromises. And if there's no compromises, if you insist, it will quickly turn into nitpicking. This is where PHP Stan jumps in. It puts a little layer between the implementation and the code review. The nitpicking will be done by the machine. Okay. Then there's one more thing I want to say about this. And this is actually a mistake I made in the last year, because I thought, wow, PHP Stan, such a powerful tool. I've been using it for 2 years now. And let's just take this, make this a task for our junior developers, and they can go ahead. Just run it on the code, then see some of the errors, and then they can read the documentation, and they can learn from this. And I have to say this was a mistake, because it didn't work out. A way better way to do this is actually pair programming sessions. And why do we want to do this? Because we want to turn this part also into semantics. I call this reflection. So if we don't have to care that much anymore about the syntax there, suddenly we can have discussions why we're doing stuff like this. So why are we doing dependency injection? Why are we using interfaces? Why are we using these particular interfaces? How do we separate different functionality into different services? How to correctly instantiate plugins? And then this discussion just grows and grows, and you get to things like, okay, how do we actually get field values safely? How do we want to write our PHP docs? And I think the last 2 slides that you saw are the most important of this talk. So yes, you should use it. And then leverage on PHP Stan. Don't make it about the syntax, make it about the semantics. Okay, now to the fun part, some experience that we made. How do you actually introduce PHP Stan to a large-scale project? And there's 4 things I would like to talk about. So that's rule levels, generating a baseline, going module by module, and then ignoring errors, but with an asterisk. Now the next slide. I just want to give you a little project overview. Again, this is not really important, but so you get a feeling of it. We have a very demanding client, and the relaunch we were doing was feature and design focused. So I'm a backend developer, that's always good. Then also we took over this project from a different agency, and they inherited some high technical debt for us. Then throughout the project, it was a fast-moving code base. There was limited test coverage many interfaces to external services. And then also, during the relaunch, we wanted to introduce a new entity architecture. And also, we moved from a decoupled application to a coupled application. This is a lot all at once. And let me show you this on a small timeline. So sometime in the end of 21, there was a vision for a relaunch. Okay, we really want to do this. Then some design sprints happened. And around the middle of 22, we started with development. And what I find interesting, actually before Christmas, we had an editors release. So one of the requirements by the client was we want to curate our content before we do the relaunch. Makes sense, but if you're a backend developer or even a front-end developer, you know this makes it a lot harder because everything you build after the editors release has to be backwards compatible, or you have to write a migration. Then there's some heavy lifting before March, but at some point in March, we finally got to the public release. Okay. So the first concept we should understand is rule levels, probably the most basic. And again, I could put all the rule levels here, wouldn't really help you. My advice is go to the PHP Stan documentation and read about it. Actually, the PHP Stan documentation is really, really good. It not only has guides on how to use it, but then also how to develop extensions. And then also they have a really good blog where they discuss more involved topics. So here you just need to know there are 9 levels. So it goes from 0 to 9. And with every level that we're going up, it's getting more strict. Essentially, level 0 means PHP Stan runs. Excellent, we are able to install it. Then if you have a project for a client, then I would recommend the minimum would be level 2. Then you can find applications. It checks for unknown method calls on all expressions. It validates your PHP docs, really nice. Our goal was level 5. So then we're checking all the types for arguments and return types and property types. It also does nice things like checking for unreachable code and dead code, dead conditions, stuff like this. This is mostly for client projects. But if you're a module developer and your module gets used by a wide audience, then you should really consider to go even higher. So try to go to level 9. And it will be hard, again, because mostly Drupal does a lot of stuff with arrays, and arrays can be a little bit annoying in PHP Stan, because essentially PHP Stan wants to know what's going on inside of the arrays. But you will get there. And then also there's bleeding edge, so if you want to go beyond, but I don't have that much experience with bleeding edge. Then the next approach is generating a baseline. And there's a really easy command for this. And the idea of generating a baseline is we assume, for example, we're at level 5, but we're going to take all the errors that we receive and put them into a file. So it will be PHP Stan baseline neon in this case. And this file should be included in your configuration. And then let's look at this file. And this might be a little surprise, because actually we're using PHP Stan in core. And we're using PHP Stan on level 1 for Drupal 10.1. And this is the beginning of the baseline in Drupal core. So that's the approach we chose there. Nice thing you can see, it's just doing a match for the error message, but then also it gives you a count of how often this error occurs. So if you do this for your own project, then you can just say, okay, today is Friday, maybe I do a little relaxed day. I can go to the baseline, pick out one of the errors, and then try to bring this counter down. So essentially, again, you assume you're on level 5, and then you're taking step by step all the errors. And at some point, you're really at level 5 when this baseline is empty. Now, the approach that we followed was going module by module. And this is also fairly simple. You can just pass an argument to this command or a parameter and point to the module that you want to check. So in this case, we want to check the example module. And this was helpful in our case because we could really concentrate on what the module actually does. As I showed you, there was a big relaunch, so there was also decisions. Should we deprecate certain modules? Should we rewrite it? Does it still make sense? So putting this together a little bit with PHP Stan was really nice. And then also, this is really helpful when you're writing new code. So imagine we're writing a new module for this relaunch, then we don't want to introduce even more errors. So for the new modules, you can always use this command. So you're up par. Then also, you can adjust your configuration to exclude certain modules. That's what I was talking about. Maybe there's a deprecated module, maybe there's still a draft module. And then you can also use wild cards, which is really nice if you, for example, have further dependencies. Or if you don't want to analyze test files, for example. Okay. Then the last one is ignoring errors with an asterisk. Actually, I do not recommend ignoring errors. And at most, you should ignore one line, in my opinion. And this would look like this. PHP Stan ignore next line. This one also works well with the Drupal coding standards. A more interesting case is adding errors to your configuration. So this is probably the most typical example, unsafe usage of new static. This is actually a standard in Drupal because we want to extend our plugins. But from a code perspective, again, this might not be strict enough. But actually, my message here is, if you see something like this, if you find something in Drupal that doesn't work well yet, then there's also the chance to contribute. Again, PHP Stan Drupal is an extension for PHP Stan. And you can help go to the GitHub repository. The easiest way to get into this is actually writing stub files. So what are stub files? The concept, essentially, imagine you have Drupal core. Drupal core is not doing something well, for example, in the PHP docs. You can replace the function call with the types and also the PHP docs. It's kind of a patch on top of the types that you're declaring. And I did this 2 weeks ago. It was a nice success for myself. I got a little thing that annoyed me all the time into PHP Stan Drupal. Okay, let's put this in context a little bit again. We have the timeline of our project here. And you already see the title of this slide. And maybe you notice there are some extra blue markers. And the message is, yeah, take your time. Now, I sat down and installed PHP Stan, and I somehow brought it up to level 1. But actually, it took us a really long time to get to level 2. And I can also show you the reason. When we started with this, we had around 800 errors in our project. Now, when I went to my project manager and I told, we have 800 errors that we have to fix, okay, there's a huge task in front of us. But then actually, as I said, when you reach level 2, it's already a major improvement, so 150 errors. I didn't say this is with respect to level 5. Our goal was level 5. And then the second orange dot is the relaunch, the public relaunch. So we only managed to raise the PHP Stan level afterwards. If you have the chance to do it before, my recommendation is do it before. But as you know, there was a lot of heavy lifting. So this is going down 60, 48, and 23. And right now there's a sitting merge request to hopefully get it down to 0 in 1 or 2 weeks. Okay, as I said, I'll provide some references. If you want to get a general overview, I think the best blog post is by Matt Gleiman. He is also the maintainer of PHP Stan Drupal. And it's called Tighten Up Your Drupal Code Using PHP Stan. And if you want the technical counterpart of this talk, then you can also go to the video, which is corresponding to this blog post from the Florida Drupal camp, really informative. Then, as I said, PHP Stan documentation itself is really well written. So if you get an error, usually you can paste it into their search bar, and then you will directly find it with recommendations how to fix it. Then, of course, as I mentioned, there's the PHP Stan Drupal GitHub repository. Then if you want a light introduction, there's also a nice podcast. Shout out to Mike, Drupal Easy. And as I said, we have a Drupal core issue. Fix as many PHP Stan level 2 issues as possible before bumping the rule level. There's a lot of issues branching off from this, but this is a good starting point. Another recommendation, actually Matt Gleiman, he is streaming every Wednesday. I think next week he will be on vacation, but it's very interesting to see an experienced developer working on this extension. And he's also working on an ambitious project, which is called Retrofit. And then he also does stuff for Drupal Rector. So if you have the time, I think in our time zone, this is 9 p.m. on Wednesdays. Then one more shout out to Stephanie, who provided us with some nice free coffee illustrations. Okay, key takeaways. This is the stuff you should remember. Just use it. The long-term benefits outweigh the short-term investments by far. Prioritize collaboration. Shift from nitpicking to valuable discussions and reflection. Then also, as we saw in our project, take your time. There are multiple techniques to introduce PHP Stan. And the last one is coming from me personally. PHP Stan does not only improve your code quality, but also makes you a better developer. I really learned a lot using this tool. And overall, PHP Stan is so powerful that I think that also in the Drupal community, at some point, this will become a standard. Okay, then the reason why I'm here, of course, I want to say a little shout out to Factorial. Thanks for sending us here. It's a lot of fun. Then also, if you're interested in projects like these and you liked some of the things you heard about the way we work, then you can go to the jobs sections. We have some postings for backend, frontend, DevOps, and also project management. And then also, if you want to contact me, the best way is actually with email. I'm not really a social media guy, so shoot an email there. We can also have a discussion going a little bit deeper into the configuration or some best practices. I'm open to have a conversation. And then this is my handle on Drupal. This is mostly relevant if you want to contact me on Slack. But I'm not on Slack every day. Email is the fastest. Okay, and then I'm pretty much on time, and maybe we can have some questions.
Great first talk at a Drupal event. You should do it more often. Have you found any drawbacks to raising the levels in PHP Stan gradually? For example, because you introduced new code while on level 1 that you then had to fix on level 2.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit careful because, of course, it's in the base configuration. And I already mentioned, if you have it in your base configuration, maybe level 2, and you develop new stuff, this is actually a drawback because you have to be very careful. But probably there's a way to set it up more sophisticated. But essentially, again, if you're having conversation with all your developers and you all know what you want to do, then this can be part of your toolkit, right? When I push something, then before I run PHP Stan. And then, of course, it's also running in our CI and on our merge request, but it's also really fast. It takes, I don't know, 5 to 10 seconds. It does not take a lot of time from your development time.
Would you say there's reasons not to just go to level 8 or 9 and accept a bigger baseline so that at least all your new code is at the higher standards?
I mean, let's think about Drupal core. If we put level 9 there, the baseline is going to be 200 MB or something. So it might be overwhelming.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, so I will say I use it like I use PHPCS, and I have it configured with PHP Storm and VS Code to show the problems in the Problems tab.
Yep.
So rather than waiting until I'm done coding something to run to analyze, it's always running. So as soon as I type a line of code, it will give me the squiggly and it'll show up in the Problems tab, and then I fix it immediately. I find that, for me, that works best rather than waiting until I'm done for the day or waiting and doing it like in a CI operation.
Yes, this is also possible. So you can configure it as a, I mean, it's probably included natively into PHP Storm, for example, right? But I think if you have it running all the time and your project is pretty large, by the way, also PHP Stan does caching, so that's nice, but sometimes it can be a little bit clunky. That's my experience. Yeah, but even this statement is not 100% true because, of course, it's looking at all the different references in your file, right? Yes. Oh, that's our nice screensaver. Pretty cool. I'm not using it. Of course, everyone has a little different development setup, right? I just like to also develop and not always get reminded, oh, you're doing something wrong there. Sometimes you have some draft code, you know, you just want to try it out. I like to do it before I push my code.
Thank you, Simon. Really a great presentation, especially given the time of the day. The last part is an interesting thing for me, and I want to ask you at Factorial, how do you integrate this tool in your daily workflows? Maybe you don't want to test a large code base on every little commit, so you might use Git hooks, or maybe you have a ACI workflow where you block merge requests if they don't fill PHP Stan. I guess you don't run it manually or leave it to the developers if they run it or not. Can you tell us something about this?
Yeah, this is actually some of the technical details that you could get into. How do I put this in my CI/CD and so on and so forth? Currently, we run it on merge requests. So before something gets merged, even if it's from one feature branch to another, we have PHP Stan running, then everyone can do it locally, of course. And then, of course, before we do deployments. And we're running, yeah, I think the setup is quite good. Especially because we also like to work with draft merge requests. This is maybe not typical for every agency, but sometimes it's just easier to collaborate if you have a draft merge request and you can exchange some ideas there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the talk. I wonder whether you have considered any alternatives to PHP Stan.
Yes, there is alternatives. but PHP Stan has the best integration, I would say, at the moment with Drupal. And then also, you have to look at the surroundings a little bit. And if Drupal core is adopting PHP Stan, then I think it's a good idea to also follow this path. But of course, if you look around a little bit, there's other, even, Psalm, for example, in the PHP universe, let's say.
Thanks for your great presentation. I learned a lot. I wanted to share with you, with all of you, some experience that we had. So we had internally the discussion about when we should run PHP Stan and why. We discovered that on the merge request, when you are done and you push your code there, probably it's too late, and you spend a lot of time. You think that you are done, but you are not. And also, we had in contracts the option from on integrated on the ID, and we thought that it's a little bit overwhelming. In between, we found that with Git hooks is in the middle. Git hooks, sorry.
Yes.
So we are using Gram PHP to orchestrate several tools, not only PHP Stan, and also making sure that the commits are following a message with a certain pattern, and it worked pretty well for us. So just wanted to share with everyone our experience, and that's it.
Yeah, I can agree with this. We also use Git hooks for the linting and code styling, etc. But not PHP Stan at the moment in the Git hooks.
Has using PHP Stan changed your view of the code patterns that you see in core? For example, your code examples used string or false, where I think these days that would probably be nullable. Another example I can think of is maybe the second parameter to decide whether you want a string or an object.
It's quite funny because, I was using some of the old functions, for example, and again, there's some decisions happening even in that little code, because if you look at file create URL, it returns null, false, or a string. And we have a lot of this in the code where there's no real decision. Should we use null? Should we use false? And I think it would be beneficial to kind of have a meta topic about this, how we approach it. And I know there's also some issues regarding this, but maybe another comment on this. Again, that's why I said, for example, how we're getting fields. You can also see it as a protection layer on top of core, right? If you have these old functions, and you have a little method like this, you can actually translate the types into something that you want to use, right? So in this case, I just threw out null. I only want to have string and false because that's what I want to continue working with. And especially in this code base, we have this a lot because I said we're integrating with a lot of other services, and then maybe you use contrib modules. And there's always this kind of little, we are hardening the code. If that's the right term, we're tightening it up. More questions? Hi.
Hi. I was wondering, so you talked about the baseline and disabling stuff. But one thing, especially in the higher levels, I noticed that some of the rules are becoming more and more opinionated. So like how many methods are okay to be in one class and stuff like that. So to me, there comes a third option, just trying to configure the rules and just changing what's seen as right or wrong. Did you do anything there? Do you have any experiences with that?
I'm slowly getting into this. This is again contributing to PHP Stan Drupal, because we want to teach PHP Stan how Drupal behaves. But then if you get into PHP Stan and how all the nodes are built, how kind of the code is interpreted, it gets quite involved, I would say. And then you also need to know a lot about reflection. So I would say this is high-level programming. But then, as I said, we also had a lot of discussions. Can we have a trait, for example, here, where we do this abstraction again, right? And maybe we do it our own way. And this is something that you do with your team, right? So we have a couple traits. Again, for example, getting fields safely. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question perfectly, because you're asking about the higher levels, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more talking about that some of the rules are configurable so that you can like kind of define what exactly, like my example where how many methods are okay to be in one class. And there's like, you either, if there's some class where for some, like in your project, reasonable reason, there have to be more methods in one class, you either just ignore it there, or you change the configuration of that rule globally by saying, okay, in our project, it's okay to have, I don't know, 20 methods in one class or whatever.
Yes. And this is also something that I left out, and we should go to PHP Stan documentation, because if you go to the ignoring errors tab, for example, there's a lot of flags that you can set. For example, also this thing I talked about with the analyzing the errors and so on and so forth. So there are options for configuration, but I'm not entirely sure about changing rules and stuff. Maybe you can teach me something.
Yeah, well, okay. I was just curious, because I think you need to choose on a per situation if you're going to ignore it or if you're going to change the rules. And I was just curious how you handle that situation. But yeah.
Could I just reply? Yeah. At the risk of nitpicking on your example, PHP Stan itself doesn't concern itself with things like how many methods are in a class, because those are more like code organizational and complexity issues. So if you look at the higher levels, like I opened the docs because so you get to missing type hints, you get to things in union type. So if you have interfaces where a method might be on one interface but not another, then those cases are things you need to handle. I think funnily enough, the lowest levels are the hardest. And if you're at 5, I would encourage you to just bump to 8. I hope Drupal can get to 9 quickly, because we're adding mixed in a lot of places, and I dread the day that we switch 9 and then we see the only rule in level 9 is that mixed becomes a poisonous type. So if you get mixed, you can only give mixed to a function that takes mixed, and then you need to do a lot of manual type checking to reduce it lower. So that may be more something for the core contributors to think about.
Mixed is dangerous.
Yeah, I think you can continue with discussion at the party, because we are 20 minutes over. So yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.